Howdy readers, I'm Jason. This is Chapter and Verse. And this is the first ramble in 2 weeks. So before we get to what I've been reading and the films that I've been watching, just a couple of things, right? So I've been promising to keep you guys updated on my weight, and I am down 3 pounds from where I was 2 weeks ago, which is good. So that's promising. Yeah, that's very promising. So I'm really happy about that. The second thing is that my wife Kelly wanted me to mention to you guys that she put up a video today wherein she issued a challenge to people who have channels. And I don't remember exactly the details, but I think it's called the St. Patrick's Day Shoutout Challenge. And I will link to that video in the description box below. And I think what she wants you to do is, again, if you have a channel, between now and St. Patrick's Day, to shout out, I think, 3 booktubers who have fewer subscribers than your channel does, which is a cool idea. She told me that Steve Donahue left a comment on her video and asked if he could do it every day, which would be wonderful. Because yeah, I mean, the whole point is, and I think that she touches on this in her video, you know, however much our channel has grown and wherever we would like our channel to be in the end, subscriber wise, we can always use a hand, right? We can always use a little bit of help. So anyway, if you would check out her video, she would be really grateful. Now to what I've been reading, and then we'll tackle the films after that. So as you guys know, I have been reading Red Comet by Heather Clark for March of the Mammoths. And I'm not very far into it. I'm only just a little over 100 pages, not including the prologue. And before I talk to you guys about Red Comet, my impressions thus far, I wanted to just share with you the fact that I have read prior to Red Comet. Now, this was quite some time ago. This is more than 10 years or more than 15 years ago that I read these. But I've read 3 other Sylvia Plath biographies, right? Not including The Silent Woman by, I think it was Janet Malcolm who wrote that, which is not strictly a biography, so I'm not counting that. But I did read Sylvia Plath, a biography by Linda Wagner-Martin, once upon a time. And I read Bitter Fame, A Life of Sylvia Plath by Anne Stevenson, which is by far the weakest of the 3 biographies, for one principal reason, and that is that Anne Stevenson was hired to write this biography by Olwen Hughes, and essentially it was just meant to be a kind of hit job on the reputation of Sylvia Plath. So there are moments in this biography that just really infuriate me as a reader, because you feel like the author herself is being cruel in a way that isn't necessary. So, and the third biography of Plath that I've read is Rough Magic, and that is by Paul Alexander. And this is my favorite of the 3. I love this biography, and it gets a lot of shit sometimes because Paul Alexander did not have permission to quote from any of Plath's work, and so it doesn't do any of what we see Heather Clark doing a lot of in Red Comet, in that this biography is just essentially giving us the kind of portrait of the narrative of her life without very much in the way of critical interpretation or kind of weaving the texts of her life into her life, because he was unable to do that. But as a narrative and as a kind of a conjuring up of her life and the events of her life and the ways in which they were important to her and how they shaped her, etc., etc. This is a wonderful read. I have no idea if it's still in print, but it's just a magnificent book. Okay. Now, I bring up the fact that I have read these 3 other Plath biographies for one reason, which will become clear here in just a moment. So in Red Comet, okay, and read Comet. Heather Clark's stated aim in this book, in the prologue. Okay, so let's just turn. I've got like 100 stickies in this thing already. It's crazy. All right, so I'm going to read you a paragraph in which you will hear her stated aim in the writing of this book. This book is by no means the last word on Sylvia Plath. Over time, new material will surface and new questions will emerge, but it is, I hope, a richer, more accurate, and less pathological portrait of Sylvia Plath's life than what now exists. By sifting through Plath's poems, prose, sketches, journals, and letters, as well as the transatlantic archives of her husband and contemporaries, and listening to the testimony of dozens of friends, many on record for the first time, I have tried to recover what Plath gave to us rather than what she gave up. I hope to free Plath from the cultural baggage of the past 50 years and reposition her as one of the most important American writers of the 20th century. Plath's best poetry is as aesthetically accomplished, groundbreaking, and reflective of its historical moment as the poetry of her idols W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot. She ought to be remembered for her transcendent, trailblazing poems, not for gassing herself in her kitchen. Okay. All right, so in a nutshell, okay, Heather Clark's stated aim in writing this book is to reframe Plath's legacy as one of discipline and achievement rather than pathology and suicide. Okay. Now, if we zip forward to the end of the prologue, we see her write this. Plath's second collection, Ariel, became a bestseller, as did her 1963 novel, The Bell Jar, which would go on to sell more than 4 million copies. She would win a posthumous Pulitzer Prize in 1982 for her collected poems, and is now widely considered one of the most innovative, accomplished, and influential poets of the 20th century. Okay. Now, if Plath is, as Heather Clark says right here, if Plath is now widely considered, quote, is now widely considered one of the most innovative, accomplished, and influential poets of the 20th century, why would she need to hope to free Plath from the cultural baggage of the past 50 years and reposition her as one of the most important American writers of the 20th century? If she's already widely considered that, why does Heather Clark need to reposition her as such, right? So my antennae were on alert already in the prologue. The problem is this, right? And I've got notes here. I'm referring to my notes. Okay. Heather Clark, to some extent, has made a kind of straw man of the work of past biographers. Okay. She tells us in the prologue and elsewhere in the first 100 pages of the book that these past biographers have painted Plath as a mad genius whose headlong terminus was her suicide, right? A kind of inescapable fate. And she claims to want to show us that Plath was not a genius in the sense of like she didn't have to work for her poetry, right? They didn't just come to her fully formed. Her claim is that these biographers tried to paint Plath in that way, right? That she was a writer who you know wasn't disciplined, et cetera, and who had flashes of inspiration, and you know the poems just kind of came out of her. But that's not the case, right? In these other biographies I've read of Plath, to some extent, they all paint her as a disciplined, dedicated craftswoman, right? A poet who is deeply concerned with technique and revision. And so, you know, for Heather Clark to make that claim for her own book and to try to set it apart from past biographies, implying that her biography is the one that will show that Plath was this kind of dedicated, precise, careful craftswoman, right? That she was a kind of devoted, eagle-eyed poet, right? And that her poetry, her greatest poetry, including her greatest poetry, was the product of such attention to detail in the craft of it. It doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. Like she's trying to set her own biography apart from the work of her predecessors, when in fact what she's doing is the same kind of thing in many ways that they did. She's just got a hell of a lot more research. She had a lot more documents that she had access to. There's a lot of quoting going on in the book, which is great for the most part. But yeah, it bothers me that she's kind of set up this figure of what past biographies have done in order to I don't know, allow hers to seem, as though it's transcending theirs, right? It's a kind of phoenix, rising from the ashes of theirs, what their failures were. And when in fact she's doing much the same thing, right? It's just more exhaustive. The other thing that really bothers me about what she's doing along these lines is that throughout the first 100 pages, there are multiple times, right? 3, 4, maybe 5 times, where she is trying to make a kind of sweeping or blanket statement about what other biographers have done, right? Other biographies or biographies in the past have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she'll go on to quote something from one of these other biographies. I would turn to the notes at the back, and almost every single time that happened, it was the work of a single biography. So she is taking, what's the title of it here? Mad Girl's Love Song by Andrew Wilson. And she is frequently quoting from it. And she's prefacing these quotes, right? These quotes that are painting Plath in this really pathological light. She's prefacing these quotes with biographies in the past have ... right? And then a quote. And but when you look at the notes in the back, the quotes are almost always from a single biography, right? And there have been many biographies written of Plath, but all of the quotes that she's referencing, almost all of them, are of a single biography published in 2013. And that feels intellectually dishonest to me. And I think one of the reasons why it feels intellectually dishonest is I think, any writer of a book this size is going to presume, I think, that most readers are not going to check the notes, and that most readers are not going to have read multiple other works along these same lines about this same figure. And so they're going to take what they're reading on the page as gospel. And but if you look closely at the notes, there's something just a little dicey about what she's doing. There's something a little inauthentic about what she's doing. And we'll see, again, I'm only like 110 pages into it, but we will see if she continues doing that throughout the book, if she continues trying to kind of pass Mad Girl's Love Song, the biography Mad Girl's Love Song, off as representative of the kind of entire catalog of biographies that came before Red Comet. Now, there is a lot that she's doing right in this biography. Namely, she is exceptional on context, okay? On giving us a sense of the time that Plath was living in, and the pressures that Plath, contended with, and how these pressures, how these expectations, how these events were, to some extent exerting a kind of influence on her, right? We might look at it as like pressure turning a piece of coal into a diamond. The best thing that she's done as far as context goes, in my opinion, is on, it's the beginning of a chapter. It's on page 52 and 53, at the beginning of the chapter 3, The Shadow. And she spends the first couple pages of this chapter talking about the fact that Plath, grew up during World War II, and that there were magazines, Life magazine, right, that had these layouts of Nazi atrocities, etc., etc. What is so wonderful about this is that it gives us a sense, right, of the kinds of material, right? The kinds of anxieties, the kinds of worries, the kinds of concerns that Plath was living with on a day-to-day basis, right? Like, so she wasn't living through the war on the European continent, right? She wasn't in a camp, et cetera, et cetera. But she was aware of these things at an age when she was incredibly impressionable, right? 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. And as all of us know, because we have lived through those ages, the stuff that happens to us, the stuff that we see, the stuff that we hear about, at those ages, it imprints on us, right? I mean, it tattoos us somehow. And, and so when we think of her late poetry, where she appropriated the language of World War II and the Third Reich and the Holocaust, it makes sense to think that she would use imagery like that when she had been very much so kind of in the soup of this whole thing, as far as the news was concerned, the magazines that she was exposed to, living right there on the edge of the ocean, and having that concern about the possibility of U-boat activity. And I just thought it was really refreshing, and really illuminating how Clarke gives us this portrait of the kind of political and cultural world that Plath became a young woman in, and how those events and how what she saw and what she heard about and what she was afraid of, et cetera, how these things stayed with her throughout her life and haunted her on some level, and she found a way to kind of exercise those horrors from her mind right on the page. And I think that's kind of astounding. It makes me really excited to see what she does with the mature work of Plath later in the book, because I'm still in the juvenile years. Right? She's still a teenager. So my biggest problem with the book so far, however, is that it too often focuses on a parade of minutia, right? So on page 71, she writes about when Sylvia Plath saw her first play in Boston, a production of The Tempest by Shakespeare. And for those of you who have read Plath's poetry, you'll know just how important The Tempest is to her late poetry. And Heather Clarke does almost nothing with that event in Plath's life. Almost nothing. Devotes half a page to it, has 1 or 2 sentences of insight at the end of a paragraph, and then can't be bothered to kind of, dive any deeper into her experience of seeing The Tempest, right? Because there's all this detail that she has to get to, right? Right. So she moves from she gives us this brilliant sentence at the end of that passage, right? Sexual longing and creative exuberance already existed in Laurentian tandem. It's a brilliant insight, right? It has to do with not only the play that she's just seen, but with an experience that she has, I think, on the bus home afterward. And the very next paragraph begins with, boys, in fact, were an increasing distraction, as were sports. And then she goes, just through this litany of all of these things that Plath did as a teenager. And it's all interesting, right? It's all fascinating, but I'm not sure how important much of it is. And I think that what she's doing is, I think that she's too often focusing on, these little tiny, I've read a lot of reviews of the book, and the word I saw just kept popping up was granular, right? She focuses on this granular detail, right? Getting right down under the microscope of the the events, the day-to-day kind of lived existence of Sylvia Plath as a teenager. She focuses on that detail at the expense of the degree to which she might explore some of these really significant events in young Sylvia Plath's life. Now, if you guys will remember, Rough Magic by Paul Alexander is my favorite of the Plath biographies. And if I remember correctly, I haven't gone back in and double checked this, but if I remember correctly, Paul Alexander begins this biography with that scene, right? With Plath seeing the Tempest as a girl in Boston. And he just puts his gloves on. He just goes right in to the soil, to the kind of loamy possibility of that event, and it helps us to understand how it came to frame, on some level, her understanding of her father and her father's death, and also looking forward, how that event, her seeing that play, her being overwhelmed by that play, would like the events of World War II and the Holocaust would go on to kind of haunt her, and it would appear in her late work, right? Not as like, oh, hey, there was this play I saw when I was a kid. It'd be nice to reference something from Shakespeare, right? I haven't read The Tempest in a while. Maybe I should look at it again and pull a couple of lines out. Maybe name my book after it or something like this. No, not in a way like that. Not in any kind of cheap way. But The Tempest went on to, again, right, frame her use of her father as a figure and as a metaphor in her poetry. It was an incredibly important kind of benchmark, I think, in the life of young Sylvia Plath. Her seeing that play, and Heather Clark just fucking races past it, right? Because there's boys and sports to get to. Hopefully, as I get further into Red Comet, as we start to explore Sylvia Plath's adulthood, hopefully Heather Clark will put the brakes on a little bit and spend a little bit more time kind of sussing out the significance of some of these things that happened to Sylvia Plath, because she's not doing that as much as I would like with Plath's childhood and adolescence. But anyway, so that's where I'm at with Red Comet. Now I wanted to talk to you guys just real briefly about a couple of films. All right, so let me open my film journal here. And since I last talked to you, let me see. I have watched 6 movies. Okay, I have watched The Iron Horse by John Ford, which was magnificent. Nomadland by Chloé Zhao, which is streaming right now on Hulu, and is my second favorite film of 2020. I'm thinking of Ending Things by Charlie Kaufman, which I will probably talk about in detail in a later video, because I'm planning to rewatch that soon. Songs My Brothers Taught Me, also directed by Chloé Zhao, who made Nomadland. Pieces of a Woman, directed by Cornel Mundrusco. I'm probably getting that name wrong. I watched that for our Wednesday night film club. Had a wonderfully animated conversation about that today over Zoom with my friend Ben. I've never heard him tear apart a movie like he tore apart Pieces of a Woman. And then last night I rewatched Sound of Metal, directed by Darius Martyr, which is my favorite film of 2020 so far. But I wanted to say a few things about Nomadland and Songs My Brothers Taught Me, right? So Chloé Zhao is a filmmaker who, if I remember correctly, studied film at NYU. And I think she's in her late 30s now. She's made 3 features, right? Those 2, and her middle feature was called The Rider, which I haven't seen yet. And Nomadland is just winning it's like winning all the awards right now. All the critics awards. She has basically swept all of the Best Director prizes for that film. And I would say she deserves them. Okay, now there are many things that are wonderful about Nomadland. But one of the things that I love so much about it, which is going to come as no surprise to all of you who follow this channel for any length of time, Chloé Zhao is a kind of Terrence Malick disciple, right? She really, really loves the cinema of Terrence Malick. She loves what he does with the camera. She loves his relationship with light, with natural light. And here's the thing. So a few weeks ago, right, I talked a little bit about The Dig. And I loved The Dig. Don't get me wrong. I thought The Dig was just marvelous. And there's a lot of kind of Terrence Malick influence in the way in which The Dig was shot. Now, The Dig looks like a film that was made by a director who loves the work of Terrence Malick and wanted to try to make his film as though Terrence Malick might have made it, okay? Nothing wrong with that. but it feels like, when you're watching The Dig, you're like, oh, this is a Malick technique, or this is something Malick might do, et cetera, et cetera. And it feels like another director kind of wearing the cloak of Malick, right, or wearing the personality of Malick in his decision making process. Now, when you watch Nomadland and Songs My Brothers Taught Me, but particularly I think Nomadland, it feels like you're watching the work of a filmmaker who loves the work of Terrence Malick, and instead of trying to make a film in his style, she loves his work so much that she's kind of absorbed it into her, filmmaking DNA, and it's coming out naturally in her own perspective. And that is sort of exhilarating to think about. Yeah, I mean, there are moments in Nomadland, and again, it doesn't feel like, oh, she's trying to shoot this like Malick. It feels like Malick, right? It doesn't look like Malick, appear like Malick. Like, it feels like it's something Malick had actually done, right? It seems like Chloé Zhao is seeing the world in the same way that he does, right? That they're kindred spirits somehow. And I love that. And I think about how cool that must make Malick feel, actually, to see his influence on filmmakers in his own lifetime. Because I just don't think that happens much. I just don't think that happens often at all. It probably happened with John Ford. It probably happened with, like, Kubrick. But even with somebody like, it's happened with Scorsese. It happened with Robert Altman. But even somebody like, Steven Spielberg, like, I don't think Spielberg is necessarily aware of the influence his cinema has had, in the styles of young filmmakers who have followed in his footsteps. But yeah, so it doesn't happen often, and Malick is still alive and still making movies, and the fact that he can see this is magnificent, and the fact that Nomadland, that this film that is told very much in his sensibility, right, through his lens, you might say, exists. This movie about this culture of people who, with the recession, a decade and a half ago, I guess, almost, with a recession, were met with circumstances that just pulled the rug out from under their lives, and were forced to improvise and sort of think on the fly. And they took up this kind of nomadic existence, looking for work, traveling from place to place, living in their vans and their campers. It feels like such an important film. It feels like a really timely film, and it juggles beauty and hope with despair and with a kind of tenuousness of existence that is just remarkable to watch unfold on the screen. I loved the movie from the beginning, but as it went on, I loved it more and more. And by the end, I was just kind of overwhelmed by how magnificent it was. And I can't wait to see what Chloé Zhao does down the road. Her next movie is a Marvel movie, and I am not a Marvel comic book movie guy anymore. But that might change things for me. I'm not sure why I'm just all of a sudden really stuffy and nasally, but apologies for that. So the other film I watched of hers is Songs My Brothers Taught Me, and it was her first film. And of all of the movies I've ever seen about Native American life, Native American culture, Native American existence, this is by far the best, the most honest, the most raw, the most poignant. It's a harrowing film. It's a beautiful film. And it's a film that understands desperation, and it understands melancholy, I think. And it reminded me a hell of a lot actually, of the first chapter in the Chris Hedges, Joe Sacco book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, which is on a bookcase right over there, but I forgot to bring it with me. So I won't show you the cover. But, if you have any kind of abiding interest at all in Native American culture, in Native American identity, in the Native American plight, right? What they're going through now in reservation life. Songs My Brothers Taught Me is a movie that you need to seek out. You need to find it. It's streaming right now. I think it's still on Mubi.com. I don't know where else it would be streaming at the moment. Probably nowhere else. I'm not sure if it's for rent anywhere, but look for it. It's a great movie, and Nomadland is just a masterpiece. So she is the most exciting new filmmaker to come along for me, I think, since David Lowery. So and she's only maybe 5 years after David Lowery, something like that, 4 or 5 years after the beginning of his career in earnest. So anyway, maybe not even that much, actually, come to think of it, if I think about Ain't That Body Saint. But anyway, if you've seen these two films, let me know what you think in the comments below. And let me know if you're reading Red Comments as well. Let me know what you think of my take on the first 100 pages or so. And I will see you guys again next Sunday night. Adios.